Hey traders, welcome back to BalarezoCapital. On today's video, we're gonna go through the market update and we're also gonna take a look at the weekly watch list. The purpose of this video is to create a high probability roadmap for next week. That way we can find the best setups in the market and we can also be in the path of least resistance. So if you're interested in that information, make sure to stick all the way through this video. And before we continue with the video, guys, remember that this information is based just on my personal opinion and is not financial advice. And also, if at any point of this video you find any of this information valuable, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way we can continue to grow and reach a bigger audience so that we can help traders all around the world. So let's just jump here into the charts. And the first chart that I want to cover, it's gonna be the chart that we were talking about last week, and that's gonna be the UBXY. And what we were talking about the UBXY was this pattern that we were seeing in the candles, right? If you guys remember last week's video, I talked about the possibility of volatility starting to pick up to the upside. And we were talking about this 50, and what is really interesting is that we were talking about this 50 daily moving average. And you can see how this 50 daily moving average has been acting as a very important level of resistance. And if you recall the UBXY, one of the reasons that I like looking at the UBXY is because it tends to trade with patterns that are really similar to the patterns that we find in equities. So I find it much easier to chart the UBXY and use it as an indicator of what volatility might do. So we were talking about a possibility of volatility just picking up to the upside, and what actually happened is that we found resistance at the 50 moving average and we had a pullback. What is really interesting is that this pullback came into a very important level of support at the UBXY, and as soon as we got here, we got this kind of doji candle or a spinning bottom candle, whatever you want to call it. But this really small candle usually suggests that when we are starting to see this sell-off to the downside, when we get this small candle, is the first indication that this level might act as support as the buyers are starting to absorb the supply in the market. And then of course we had a really strong move to the upside in the UBXY, and now the question is if this is the moment that finally the UBXY breaks above that 50 daily moving average. And my answer to that question is, of course, we don't know, but it does look like this is the time that we're gonna break above it. And one of the reasons is that you can see that the distance between the 50 daily moving average and the distance between the moving averages that we have here, the 21 exponential, the 8 exponential, the 13 exponential, is starting to become smaller. And when that mode starts to become smaller, that's when we start seeing a pattern that wants to reverse and then perhaps change its trend to the upside. So that's actually really interesting in the UBXY. And if you actually recall what we were talking about the market, we were talking about a possible short-term top in the market. And if we just jump here into the SPX, we're gonna see that this is starting to play out, right? We were talking about this level, this very important level of resistance, which is 5,200. And the thing about 5,200 is that we were talking about how big of a gamma exposure we had at that level. We talk about the possibility of the SPX actually touching that level before coming back to the downside, but we were also talking about the possibility that this move to 5,185 was already the top, the short-term top in the market. And then of course it seemed that the market wanted to go up, but then of course we had this sell-off on Thursday, and then on Friday we continued to come to the downside. So now the thing, before we continue to move into the market, I just want to mention these boxes that I have here, right? If you can see these gray boxes that I have, and also these blue lines that I have in my charts, this is the market web indicator. I did mention this indicator a couple of times in the channel. You can see that I have it right here. This is the market webs, and basically this is just looking at the value areas for the week. Right, I used to have this indicator in a separate screen, but now I just put it with my main screen. That way I can also see the value areas, and these are the value areas for the week, and we tend to get some really interesting levels at that I will make a separate video about the value areas. That way you can also understand what I'm looking here in terms of the market. Now the question is, what is gonna do the SPX in the coming weeks? And now the SPX is coming into support here, right? We do have a very important level of 120, and this is a level that we were talking about during the past couple of weeks. And the thing is that if we just look at the SPX, we don't get much information from this box right here. We can also see that we continue to trend above that 21 exponential moving average. Now the question is, what actually gives us information? And I think that the Qs are actually giving a lot of information of what the market actually can do. So let me just hide this alert here. And the thing about the Qs is that the Qs are starting to look like a reversal base here. And what I mean by a reversal base is, let's take a look at the SQQQ. Right, if we take a look at the SQQQ, which is basically just the inverse ETF for the QQQ, you can see right here that we have a pretty solid base, right? If we just drew this line right here, you can see that we had this very interesting base right here. And if this base happens to break, we don't have any level of resistance all the way to this gap right here. So I do think that we are probably going to see a breakout in the SQQQ, which means that we're probably going to see a breakdown in the Qs, and then perhaps we're just going to run and close this gap that we had to the upside. And I think that that's a really high probability setup. If we happen to have a little bit of a pullback, then perhaps that's going to give us a really nice opportunity to get into the SQQ and then look for a move to the upside. But let's jump into the QQQ so that you can actually see the levels a little bit more clearly. And you can see right here that the Qs, right, if you can see, this is basically the same base. You can see that here we have the bottom, and then of course here we have the topping pattern. And now the question is, if we are actually going to break the gap that we have to fill comes all the way to 425. So basically the thesis that we are creating here is that probably the QQQ is going to break here, and you can also see that momentum is starting to break below, right? Let me just get my drawing tools. We're starting to break below that 50 line, and that's actually pretty bearish. So the price structure is bearish. The Qs are actually starting to look pretty bearish. And now the UBXY looks like it's going to break above that level of resistance, which is the 50 daily moving average. So if we make this assumption, and if we actually look at the IWM, right, the IWM is also starting to break a little bit to the downside. You can see right here that we had this stop into these positive GEX, which is the biggest level of gamma exposure that we had for the last week. That was at 210, and we got rejected from that level. Now we're trading below this 21 exponential moving average. Now the question is, what is going to happen with IWM? I do think that we're going to test this 50. We do have the pattern for it, right? You can see right here that we had kind of this wedging pattern. We broke to the downside. Now the question is, are we gonna retest this kind of level of resistance here, perhaps before going to the downside? I do think that that's a really high probability scenario for the IWM. So now that we have an understanding of the ETFs, let's jump into what are going to be the setups that are going to be watching for next week. And now if we go to the setups, one of the most important setups I'm going to be watching is going to be PNW. And the thing about PNW is that I actually do have a position here. I do have a short position in PNW. I shorted PNW at 287.75. So somewhere around here on this day right here, I shorted. And my first stop was at 300. That's why I do have these levels to understand where my target is in respect to what my first stop was. So this is going to be the R's, which is the risk, how much I was risking at the beginning, and how much I am willing, and how much I probably gonna make if this actually hits my target. So that's gonna be kind of a 1.5 R, which means that I'm risking, let's say, $1 to make $1.5. Of course, taking into account my first stop for this setup. But now that the setup is working, right, now that the setup is working and we are actually breaking below this trend line right here, then of course I'm moving my stop. Now my stop is at 295. So that actually gives me a better risk reward once the setup starts working, which is the beauty about trading, right? That's the beauty about trading, and that's what makes trading so special, that when things start working, you can actually move your stop. And once you start doing that, you realize that as long as you manage risk and as long as you look for high probability setups, then you're gonna make money, which is actually pretty amazing. But that, of course, is gonna be the topic for another video. And now the question is, my expectation about PNW is a test. You can see right here that we have this is called a virgin, a point of control. I'm gonna talk more about that in one video, but that tends to be a really magnetic level and also an important level of support. And then of course I'm using Fibonacci. If I measure this low to this swing high right here, the 1618 Fibonacci is coming also at that 200 daily moving average. So that's a pretty high probability target for this setup, which is looking pretty awesome. Of course, we are getting rejected at the moving averages. Now, some other setups I'm gonna be watching, of course, it's gonna be the Qs. We already talked about the Qs. If we are lucky enough to get some kind of bounce on Monday, early Monday, perhaps into these moving averages and into these anchor VWAPs, that's gonna be a best setup for a move at least to this 50 daily moving average. But of course, the ultimate target is gonna be a close of that gap. That's gonna be for the Qs. XLK is going to be pretty similar, so I don't think that we have to talk much about it, but it's going to be basically the same setup, also targeting that 50 daily moving average. IWM, we already mentioned it. Perhaps if we are lucky enough, we get a bounce into these anchor VWAPs, and then perhaps that's going to be a really nice entry also for a test of this 50 daily moving average. And then of course I do have Apple here. Apple continues to look like a bear flag, right? You can see right here that we continue to get rejected at this 8 exponential moving average, and of course this is starting to look like a really nice bear flag. Now the question is going to be, what is going to be the perfect entry? Let's see what happens on Monday. If we happen to see a gap, then perhaps Apple is going to test this anchor VWAP here. That's going to be a really nice setup, and then looking for a continuation to the upside. I do think that Apple is going to end up coming all the way right here to test this virgin point of control, this BPOC. I do think that we're gonna head that way, but we also do have a very important level of a put exposure of gamma. This is the negative gamma. This is gonna be at 170. That's a very important level, very big important level of support. That's gonna be for Apple. And then the last setup that I'm watching is gonna be Mara. Now the interesting thing about Mara is that we were talking about this setup last week, and I wasn't able to execute, right? I was looking for kind of a confirmation here, but then Mara all of a sudden just got a huge sell-off to the downside. I missed the target, but of course this actually came all the way to 18, which was the first target. But if we happen to get a bounce into these anchor VWAPs from this low and this high right here, then perhaps another trip to the downside into this 200 daily moving average, that will be pretty amazing for Mara. So those are going to be the setups, and basically the thesis that we created is that the market is looking bearish, and the path of least resistance, in my opinion, continues to be to the downside. We just have to be really selective with our entries. So that's gonna be it for the video, guys. I hope that you have an amazing Sunday, and I will see you on future videos. Take care and bye bye.